One of the foundations of being a realtor is abiding by the code of ethics. Sometimes an enforcement action has to happen when somebody files a complaint for potential violations of the code of ethics. This week, we bring in Gary Griffith, who's a member and chairperson for many of our professional standards cases, to give you some tips on if you find yourself a part of a professional standards ethics hearing.
10 tips for how to keep cool when you're in hot water.
Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. This is episode 136 of Talking Real, back in studios from around the state with your hosts, Jeff and Nabil. Nabil, you're in the office right now. I was, but I'm not. So here we are. But how are you today?
Doing well. Yeah, studios across the state. I like that. I like that a lot.
So we're part of this is being recorded separately from Nabil and I, and we've got our special guest coming in today who's coming in remotely as well. So, we are just leveraging technology around here to bring you Talking Real every Tuesday.
Hey, you know what? We practice what we preach.
Absolutely. So, Nabil, before we get started, any big updates you think anybody needs to know about out there?
I don't know if this is a trick question. No, I'm just kidding. I think the biggest update is, again, conference is in less than a month now.
Yeah.
So make sure that you're going to oarconference.com to check out all the great sessions that we have and all the speakers that are coming in. And of course, we're going to be there with a special live Talking Real. I feel like we brag on ourselves every week.
That's all we do. And is it even that special? Because it's not our first one. It's our second time to do such a thing. So,
it's the second annual.
It is. It is. No, we're going to have a great time at OAR Conference. I really do hope people get there. It's going to be October 6th through the 8th, and it is going to be all digital. Mm-hmm. You can head over to oarconference.com to get registered. We're going to be bringing in people like Dr. Lawrence Yoon, who's the chief economist and senior vice president of research at NAR. That is always a very interesting discussion whenever he's around.
So much knowledge with those numbers and the data trends, and yeah, it's fascinating.
Absolutely.
I was an econ major, so
you're into it. You're into it. Also from NAR, we're bringing in Dr. Jessica Lautz, and she's the vice president of demographics and behavioral insights at NAR. And so she focuses a lot on trends for NAR members and housing consumers and things like that. So again, we love data and all that kind of stuff. So we're super excited about this. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be really interesting. So tune in with us, come break through, and head on over to oarconference.com and get signed up.
For sure.
So this week we've brought in Gary Griffith, and Gary is a member of the association and is a longstanding member of our professional standards committee. Through that role, he is one of our go-to people who serves as a hearing panel chair for so many of our professional standards hearings. And we wanted to bring him in to talk about basically 10 tips we've got for you guys if you find yourself as a party to a professional standards hearing, and get his input as somebody who has chaired a number of these hearings for the last handful of years. So we're excited to have Gary on this week to do a little bit of a deep dive on professional standards.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I guess osmosely fascinated by the subject because, obviously you're fascinated by the subject. So I'm excited to hear his insight from, like you were saying, longstanding member and chairing a lot of those hearings, and get his insight, especially with the new platform that we've got going on.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in with Gary Griffith. We're joined here on Talking Real by just a fantastic, dedicated member of the Oklahoma Association of Realtors, Gary Griffith. Gary, how are you today?
I am doing absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. And we are, should be said, we're doing this over Zoom, so we are socially distanced.
Yes.
Distanced.
coming through time and space,
yes,
through the internet, so that we can have a little chat together. So that's why maybe the audio quality is a little bit different, but I think we've got some great information today. And we wanted Gary to come join us because Gary has been a longtime member of our professional standards committee. And through that, he is one of our very consistent people that we call on to serve as a chairperson for our professional standards hearings. So, Gary, I want just a little overview of how you feel about that process and the fact that we just keep calling on you to come in and chair those hearings, because you've been doing it for a while now.
Yes, it has been a while. And fortunately or unfortunately, I have been able to travel throughout the state to conduct these hearings. And I think the underlying factor that I've come away with from the time that I've been doing this is the fact that it's a serious process, and people maybe don't have the proper attitude about what is going to happen should they file a complaint or should they actually be charged with a complaint, because it is a serious situation that when we absolutely empower a panel to hear a case, it's serious and it needs to be taken so, and people need to understand the seriousness of the nature on both sides of the fence.
Right. I think one of the scariest situations for a realtor would be getting an email saying, hey, you've had a complaint against you and we have to address it and take care of it. I can't imagine, what's the best thing that they can do at that point, right? Because obviously they don't know this is coming, or maybe they do. And then at that point, that's, they should have fixed that earlier. But yeah, if, that just kind of slaps you in the face.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so for sure. And I wanted, before we get too far into it, because some people may not even really be familiar with the process. And so for, most realtors are going to be familiar with the code of ethics because they're required to do the training every few years. And when you become a new realtor member, you have to do your code of ethics training. And just as like a quick 1-minute overview, there's a process where somebody can come to the association and file a complaint if they think you have violated one of those articles of the code of ethics, one or more. And that could be a client, a member of the public, another realtor. It can really be anybody that can come and file that complaint. And so what'll happen is that complaint gets reviewed by a panel to make sure that it's kind of within our jurisdiction and the appropriate parties are named and the appropriate articles are identified. And then it goes to a hearing where you'll be in front of somebody like Gary and a handful of other members who it's sort of like a mini semi-formal trial where you present evidence, you tell your story, you can have witnesses if you want, and then that panel will determine if there was or was not a violation of the code of ethics. And if they determine that there was, then they can enact certain penalties like monetary fines. It could just be a letter of warning and could be educational classes. So that's what we're talking about today, is really focused on that code of ethics hearing process if somebody thinks that there was a violation. And so that's what we wanted to kind of focus on today and bring you some tips. If you find yourself as either a complainant or a respondent, somebody that had a complaint filed against them in one of these cases, we wanted to bring you about 10 tips, 5 that you need to think about before the hearing arrives, and 5 to think about during the hearing and preparing for that hearing so that you can be ready to make sure that process goes as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, I was just really excited and I wanted to jump right into it.
I know.
But you did mention something, Nabil, that was interesting in that you said, I can't imagine how somebody would feel if they get a letter that a complaint has been filed. If our system has a breakdown, it could be in the fact that that shouldn't be the way somebody figures out that they've got a problem, is when they get that letter. The underlying thing that I have been amazed at on the hearings that I've sat on is how many times both parties have insisted that they didn't have any contact with each other. They didn't want to talk to each other. They just filed the complaint, and we try to settle it with this panel. To me, it makes far more sense to settle it without involving 5, 6, 7 other people and several $100s expense to have a hearing. Let's sit down and talk with each other and see if we can avoid the situation, and then we wouldn't have to worry about having 10 tips of how to conduct ourselves.
Right. There's just one. Talk it out.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I think that you would probably agree that a big underlying issue, as you just kind of mentioned, really is that communication, that there's a breakdown in communication and it just spirals out of control. And so fighting back on that would be good advice up front to avoid being in this situation in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's where I was coming from.
Yep. So Gary, let's talk about some of these ideas for people to understand when they're getting into a hearing. So they've already had a complaint filed, or maybe they're thinking about filing a complaint. And so now we're moving forward in the process and we got to get ready for a hearing. So wanted to talk about a couple of things. So first of all, if you are a respondent, so somebody files a complaint against you and you get an email from us at the association that says somebody's filed a complaint and here it is and here's some documents. My first thought here is, one, don't ignore it.
Nah.
Yeah, that's step one in the process, is don't ignore it. So what do you think about that?
Well, you can't ignore it because there are time frames involved in this. We have to respond in a certain number of days, and you need to take it seriously because it is a serious situation. There are penalties involved. There are deadlines involved, and all of these have to be met. And you're going to be dealing with forms and language that you're probably unfamiliar with. So you need to really jump in and inform yourself as quickly as possible with regard to what all these documents, what all these deadlines mean, and how you are supposed to respond, and the form that the response can take.
Now, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I might need some more time. Give me time to gather this information, or whatever it is that you need to do, right? Like, it doesn't have to be like, oh my gosh, I have 7 days and I can't do it because maybe I'm out of town or whatever that is. Or you might have seen this on the 6th day. Like, what's your advice on that?
I would appeal to the Professional Standards Committee to request more time if it is needed, and if a good solid excuse is there, I would imagine that they would look favorably upon that.
Yeah, it's in most of these proceedings, if you need some additional time, your first one's typically free. It's like that in most court proceedings as well. Your first ask for extra time is usually no problem. If it's a second, third, or fourth one, well, you may be out of chances on that one. But definitely, if you need some more time, but that's not necessarily an excuse to, well, I just didn't get around to doing it. But like you said, maybe you're out of town, you've got travel planned, or there's a lot of medical emergency, those kinds of things, right, that come up for sure. So they are relatively quick timelines. So make sure you're on top of those. I think that's a great point. The next thought I had here, the second thing, was read everything carefully. Because, we send a lot of documents. These are things like the process for the day of the hearing. And like you mentioned, there's all these deadlines and timelines for being able to submit responses, and what that has to look like, and what you can respond with, and are you going to have an attorney or a realtor represent you? So reading everything carefully is really important. On top of that, it sets you up for the hearing. I mean, Gary, have you seen some instances where people maybe didn't read everything carefully and it made the hearing go a little askew?
Yes, we've had several instances, and one that I recall involved an attorney, and he was arguing with great theatrics and everything for his side, and we said, you do realize that this is an arbitration hearing. This is not an ethics hearing, and we're not even here to discuss what you were presenting. And he said, "Oh no, really? It's arbitration? Okay, well, fine. We're okay with that." And so it was just everybody needs to understand exactly what is going on, what the proceeding is, and how they're going to present their case. They need to get their ducks in a row, and not come to the hearing and leave the hearing saying, boy, if I had known that I could have done this, it might have changed the outcome, or I might have been better served. It's almost like a realtor explaining the contract to the buyer or a seller. I hate it when a buyer or seller says, I didn't know I could do that, because it is our job to explain all this to them. And it is the person who gets this correspondence, if they have a question with regard to what that language is, they can call the association and discuss the situation with with the powers that be to get it explained in real terms, what is going to happen and what you can do and what your rights and responsibilities are. Help is there.
Yeah. Fantastic advice.
Yeah, makes total sense. Know what you're talking about.
Amen.
And kind of going hand in hand with that is also just getting all your documents and things that you need to present once you know what you're talking about, getting those ready and organized. Because a lot of people have to read these.
The rule of real estate is still there. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So you can come into a hearing and say, well, I said such and such to so-and-so, and if we don't have documentation that happened, then it's really easy to say somebody said something, but if we don't prove it, it becomes hearsay. Now, we're not a trial. We're not a formal trial. We don't have all of the legalities are involved in the hearings, but at the same time, we're trying to prove something, and we're trying to prove without a reasonable doubt that this did occur, and if you have some evidence out there that needs to be presented either in person, which is the best way at a hearing to do it in person, because letters of recommendation are sometimes you wonder where the origin of them is. Did it really come from the person that was involved in this? So it's always good to be able to prove that what you are alleging or what you are saying is in fact the truth and it did happen. And the easiest way to do that is to have the people being involved in the hearing.
Absolutely. That's great. So starts with getting your evidence, any documents, if you've got text messages, emails, contracts, listing agreements that you need to submit as part of this, get that stuff organized and ready to go, because we've had cases where people have submitted hundreds of pages of documents, and then Gary in the week leading up to that and all of the other hearing panel have to read through that and figure out, because they look at these ahead of time. They'll spend part of that week ahead of time reviewing all the documents. And if it's disorganized, if it's you're just throwing in a lot of random stuff, that's not going to help your case. So making sure it's relevant to the case and organized in a way that a hearing panel can look at it and say, okay, I can see this chain of events or timeline or whatever the case is, I think is really important. And then like Gary mentioned as a follow-up there, that sometimes the best evidence, if you're going to say, oh, well, my client told me this and they're not a party to that proceeding, well, you need to ask them to come as a witness, because having those people there to say, yeah, this is what our agreement was, or whatever the case is really helpful. There's been a number of times where we've been at a hearing and there's some third party potential witness out there that nobody thought to invite. And it's up to the parties. It's not the hearing panel's job to invite them. It's up to the parties. Having that witness there could have cleared things up really well, but nobody invited them. So the hearing panel's left afterwards like, man, I sure wish we could have heard from that witness that nobody invited. That would have made things very clear. So make sure you've identified any people who are really important to attend and have them be there.
Absolutely good advice. There have been many times when we said, boy, I sure wish we could have talked to such and such, or sure wish that they could have been here to see this. And we have had, I was involved in one case one time where the respondent came in, no, it was the complainant came in and at the hearing date and had a 3-inch stack of papers that he wanted to, they wanted to put in the file for us to look at. As the hearing was getting ready to happen. So get it in early, and especially make sure that it's relevant. We're talking about a specific thing when we have an ethics hearing, and make sure everything that is being submitted is pertinent to that particular ethics complaint. Superfluous information is not going to sway anything. We're going to look at what is alleged and what is the proof that it happened. And if we get those two things, that's really all we need to be talking about. We don't need to go off in too many rabbit holes.
Yeah. So that was a few good tips kind of condensed all together. Yeah. Organize your documents, get them in early, and make sure if you have any witnesses or any, supporting cast members that they're there at the hearing.
Absolutely. Calling them cast members, I think is really great, because Gary mentioned an attorney going through theatrics earlier, and this kind of takes us to the next phase. So we're at the hearing now. And so people, what they need to know to conduct themselves, either to prepare for the hearing itself or at the hearing. And my first thought on this was to stay calm. So Gary, tell us a little bit about how, especially as a hearing panel member, how you feel about it when the parties either get very angry with each other and they're trying to go back and forth and arguing, or they've got an attorney who's beating somebody up. I mean, how does that play with you as a hearing panel member, and what's your advice to people in that respect?
Well, definitely the stay calm approach works better, because you can remember the things that are important. Once we get into a situation where it looks like it's semi-hostile, then there are messages that are sent back and forth when shouldn't be, and it gets too personal. And sometimes when you have a legal representation, the attorney is trying to steal the show and will ask the same question 6 or 7 different times, when one answer would have taken care of the situation, but he's trying to drive home the point of what it is, and it thinks that's the most important, pertinent thing. So the theatrics aside, if people can treat each other like human beings and tell the story, and we have the proof that's in front of us, then the panel can make a good, probably quick and purely professional assessment of what went on, and come up with a conclusion that will solve the issue. But if you get personal and get hostile, and it does happen, there are people that do lose their temper at these things, and it's very unfortunate, and it's hard to contain, and it's hard to zero back in on why we were there to start with. And that's what we need to do, is everything needs to be geared toward, we had a complaint, this is the complaint, either it did happen or it didn't happen, and was there a violation? And anything other than that, I'm going to say this, most panel members are not necessarily impressed with the theatrics that go along with a presentation. We're more interested, because we're in the same industry. We know what is supposed to happen in a transaction. We know what the code of ethics says, and we know generally when somebody steps over those bounds. So that's why we're there. The rest of it, there to prove a point or to make somebody feel better, is probably not really pertinent to what we're there for and what's going to happen in the outcome of the situation to start with.
I think that's a great point of sticking to the issue that you're there to defend, or what's the offend? I don't know.
Prosecute.
But
yeah.
Is there, so that actually brought up a question in my mind. If something else does kind of spiral out of that, you can't consider that situation, right? You have to just still pay attention to that initial issue, no matter what the other thing that's brought up says.
Absolutely. There are a lot of people will like to come in and say, well, this is what I'm complaining about. And then in presenting the evidence they have, say, and also this was done, and also that was done, and also, but those are things we can't consider. Those are things that are not in the complaint that was issued to us to come into. So again, it's one of those things, we don't consider that kind of stuff. If it were important enough, it should have been imparted the complaint to start with. But it's not going to prove or disprove what we were there and called into action to actually perform or to give some kind of a verdict with regard to.
Yeah, that happens so much, of things getting off into left field, I'll use, because I know this is audio, but we're recording this on Zoom, and Gary's background is a baseball field. So I thought that was
He's saying Dan home plate right now.
Yeah. So don't get out in left field. We got to stick
Absolutely
to the primary issues. That's all we can do. The code of ethics and the complaint that's at hand. And man, when the things do get heated, it's very difficult to prove your case if people aren't staying calm, sticking to what we can deal with that day. And this is why we appreciate, you all can tell by just listening to Gary, he's got a very calming presence. And so Gary's one of the best at just bringing people back down and saying, okay, let's all take a pause here and let's circle back, that all we can talk about are these code of ethics provisions. That's all we can talk about. So let's get back to that and let's hear evidence on that. That's all we can do.
It's probably the only thing that I dislike about doing the hearings with Zoom is the fact that if we're all in the same room together, I can look over at Jeff and say, is it time for me to shut something down or go to, but now we're on Zoom, I don't get to see him. So we don't get the high signs back and forth as to whether or not we're exceeding the speed limit on a certain situation. And we need to put the brake on just a little bit. But other than that, it's a very effective way to handle, I would say, probably 97 to 98% of the complaints we get. The Zoom hearings are more than sufficient to adjudicate via this way, rather than having to gather everybody, travel several hours and hundreds of miles to get there to talk about it. So.
Yeah, and on that point, we brought up a couple tips here for the fact that we are doing these hearings on Zoom, and now we've had, I don't know, at least half a dozen, maybe 8, 9, 10 hearings via Zoom now. And you've done a handful of those yourself as a hearing panel chair. A couple of things to think about is, first of all, for people to know how to use Zoom, right? It's technology there, familiarize yourself with it. Most people at this stage in the game where we're at today have had the opportunity to use some sort of teleconferencing, and Zoom is certainly the most popular. So know how to use that, because that is what we're using. And the second thing that goes along with that is prepare your space, because since we're not in a hearing panel room that we've got reserved, you need to be free from distractions. You need to make sure you're the only person in the room, that it's quiet so you can hear and talk, and it's not going to get into major distractions around you, which I know can be difficult if you're working from home, those kinds of things. But it's important, if you're going to be a part of one of those hearings, that you do have that space ready to go and you know how to use it. But more broadly, my view of it is the Zoom hearings, I think, have gone really well. I was really nervous about it at first, but I have noticed that it seems like the parties stay a little bit calmer because they're not right next to each other in the room together. So things seem to be a little calmer. People also seem to get to the point a little bit quicker. It seems like when they're just in a room with everybody, they have a higher likelihood of kind of going on a fairly long monologue. But certainly there are some negative components, but I kind of agree with your assessment that 97, 98% of the cases, it's really been nice to have, and keeps you from having to drive all the way up here, or other people driving all the way across the state as well. So overall, do you give it a positive rating having him by Zoom?
Yes, I do. And like you, I had trepidation about wanting to get involved with a hearing this way. I was a little nervous about it. It is obviously, I like to see people's reactions, and I'm learning through Zoom, since been on Zoom so much for the last 6 months or so, that you can read people's body language and stuff through Zoom, just like you can if you're in person with them. But it's kind of like being on television. You see yourself there, and maybe it has slowed down the animosity, or the spread of the animosity, when you realize that you're not going to be able to reach across the table and slap somebody. So we might as well present our case as logistically and as soundly as we can, and try to get it over with. I have noticed, I think the hearings don't take as long as Zoom as they do in person, and I still hope that everybody feels like, and they say they do, that they are getting a full and fair hearing when they're in a Zoom hearing format.
I'm obviously not involved with the whole hearing process, but I also do feel that the hearings get done a lot quicker, because I'll see Allison and Jeff walk out of the small conference room, and I'll be like, hearing's done already?
Well, that's if you have a good chairman. The hearings just go real smooth and real quick.
Of course.
Yeah.
So the last tip to kind of close this out for me is, and we've hit on this topic a number of times, is to know the code of ethics. And this includes the standards of practice that go along with it, because that's the only thing the hearing panel can weigh in on. All they can decide is, was there a violation of the specific code of ethics articles named? So it's important for the parties to know what those are and what they say, because that's all we can talk about. That's all we can decide. And that will help keep things focused. So know going into it that anything outside of the code of ethics is irrelevant. So wanted to kind of touch on that. We've talked about it a number of times, but Gary, do you have any closing thoughts on the knowing the code of ethics there and keeping focused, or just even a more broad closing thought on being a participant in one of these hearings?
Well, I tell you, you're right. And I have a feeling, and this is not scientific, I haven't measured it, haven't figured out a way to measure it, but I just have a feeling we wouldn't have quite as many hearings if we knew the code of ethics a little bit better and paid attention to them and realized how serious they were. There are many times when we have a hearing, the hearing panel, when we go into executive session to discuss the hearing, we might point out, I wonder why they didn't have this particular article that they cited, or that particular article, or whatever. So it is definitely, the code of ethics is not something that should be taken lightly. And I realize that most people have never read the code of ethics from page 1 to all 17 articles of it. Most people read the preamble and pass the real estate test, and then somehow get through an online course of the code of ethics, and don't really delve into it deeply. But there is a lot of meat in there, and a lot of ways that we are called to act that we voluntarily have agreed to do, and somehow it still escapes us, and we still have to have hearings. So knowledge is a wonderful thing.
It is indeed.
Well said. I can't think of a better way to end it. So we hope that these 10 tips that we came up with will help you if you find yourself as a part of an ethics hearing process, whether as a complainant or as a respondent, and certainly hope that this helps explain the process a little bit more as well. Gary, we thank you so much for giving your time here to come in and talk with us here on the Talking Real podcast, but also more importantly than that, all the time that you've dedicated. You have given countless hours and miles to the professional standards process to make sure that we're having a good quality process. I think we're seeing that. We have more people participating in it, more people filing complaints and things like that, which sounds like a bad thing, but people actually participating in that process is a good thing, because it serves the goal of making sure that the code of ethics is being followed and that people are learning from those situations. Right. So thank you so much for being such a big participant in that. It's been a huge help having you there as a hearing panel chair so many times.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I guess that's one of the benefits of growing old. You get to be around and do a lot lot of things.
Did you say wise?
Wisdom? Yeah.
Growing wise?
I didn't say anything about wisdom.
Well, thanks again, Gary. We appreciate you so much, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we hope people don't necessarily find themselves as a party to a professional standards ethics hearing. Like, nobody wants that. But if you do find yourself in that situation, then, we hope that this has been helpful to give you a little bit of insight as to what that process looks like, how to best prepare for it, and make it as smooth as possible.
For sure. I mean, no one wants to be in that situation, but if you do find yourself in there, like you were saying, these tips will, help you navigate those waters smoothly. And the smoother and calmer you keep the waters, obviously, the less tumultuous it is.
Absolutely. That usually equates to better outcomes.
Exactly. You get to your destination a lot faster too.
There you go. So we thank you guys for joining us here on Talking Real for another week and another special guest. And good news, over the coming weeks, we have more special guests coming along. So make sure you're coming back week after week to see who we have in store for the future and everything that we're bringing you on the ever-improving Talking Real podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors.
That's right. And if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button so you know when the next episode is out. And share this podcast with a fellow realtor who can use this information.
Absolutely. So until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.